Okay, thanks a lot.
All right. I want to welcome everyone to the first panel discussion of the spring 2016 semester. This is part of our Great Debates, Power, People, and Politics series. And so we're going to be talking today about America's love-hate relationship with liberty. I think this is going to be somewhat of a fun and interesting topic. We have an excellent panel that I'm going to introduce to you here in a few minutes. Before I do that, I also want to announce and say that we're very pleased to be able to announce that this project has been funded by the Institute for Humane Studies and the John Templeton Foundation, who provided a grant to help make these presentations possible. So we want to certainly thank them for partnering with us on this effort. In his autobiographical novel, British playwright and author W. Somerset Maugham said, "There are two good things in life, freedom of thought and freedom of action." Many Americans would identify with this statement. After all, we remember with great affection Patrick Henry's bold declaration, "Give me liberty or give me death." The state of New Hampshire's state motto is "Live free or die." And our Declaration of Independence explicitly identifies liberty to be an unalienable right of all people. Yet if we conduct a critical examination of our actions, they sometimes seem to fail to live up to these great declarations on liberty. As I'm sure Dr. DeSpain might note, the experience of Native Americans in this country is not one that would necessarily identify liberty as the greatest aspect of American government. As most of the people are aware, as he was drafting the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson was also engaged in the enslavement of some of his fellow human beings. If we look more to our own more recent events, we've seen a major presidential candidate call for surveillance of individuals in this country based on their religion. We've seen our intelligence agencies develop and use technology to gather data on our own citizens, absent any evidence of criminal wrongdoing. We've also observed agencies like the IRS, as well as law enforcement agencies at the national, state, and local levels, seize assets and property of individuals without ever proving a crime was committed. In addition to these concerns regarding civil liberties, one can also include additional concerns regarding economic liberty, the ability of individuals to engage in mutually beneficial transactions. Whether attempts by taxi services to restrict the innovation made possible in passenger transportation by companies such as Uber, or the lobbying of U.S. auto manufacturers to limit imports of foreign-made vehicles, or the use of legally enforced price floors and price ceilings on everything from wages to dairy products. There are no shortages on the restrictions we place on the ability of individuals to choose when and how we engage in transactions with others. Why is it that we seem to have this love-hate relationship with liberty? Is it an admission simply that freedom sounds better than it really is? Is it the idea that the liberty as promoted in 1776 simply isn't compatible with modern life? Or is it the case that we simply don't believe everyone's suited for freedom? Do we believe that some won't use their freedom properly and therefore we must restrict their actions? It does seem that throughout most of our history we've had somewhat of this commitment to freedom of thought and action for me, freedom for you to do what I want you to do and say. Now, fortunately, we have four, as I said, very excellent panelists to help walk us through some of these issues today. And they're going to help us explore why Americans just can't seem to embrace liberty in its entirety sometimes, even as we claim to love its benefits. So let me introduce to you our panelists. At the far end, we have Mr. Trent England. He serves as the Vice President for Strategic Initiatives at the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs, where he is also the David and Ann Brown Distinguished Fellow for the Advancement of Liberty and directs the Center for the Constitution and Freedom. Mr. England is also the National Coordinator for the Liberty Foundation of America and an Adjunct Fellow of the Freedom Foundation. Mr. England earned his Bachelor of Arts degrees in Government from Claremont McKenna College and a law degree from George Mason University School of Law. He has contributed to 2 books and has had articles published in the Wall Street Journal, Christian Science Monitor, Washington Times, and other publications. In 2006, he took the brave step of running for the state legislature in Washington State. And you have my sympathies for that. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Trent England. Next to Professor DeSpain on the second end from this direction is Mr. Gene Perry. Mr. Perry is the Policy Director for the Oklahoma Policy Institute. He joined the Institute in January of 2011. He's a native of Oklahoma and has a Master of Arts in Journalism and a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of Oklahoma. Mr. Perry supervises the policy staff and helps identify policy priorities for the Policy Institute. His work focuses on tax and budget, education, and criminal justice policies. He also prepares the daily news update, In the Know, and maintains the Institute's website. In addition, Mr. Perry serves on the board of the Oklahoma Sustainability Network and is a member of the Oklahoma Academy of Investigative Reporters and Editors. He chairs the Communications and Advisory Committee for the State Priorities Partnership. Please welcome with me Mr. Gene Perry. Immediately to my left here is Dr. Matt DeSpain. Dr. DeSpain earned his bachelor's degree in history from Brigham Young University and his master's and PhD in history from the University of Oklahoma. He serves as a member of the history faculty here at Rose State College, where he is also the director of Native American Studies. Prior to joining Rose State College, Dr. DeSpain taught at the University of Oklahoma in both the Native American Studies program as well as the Department of History. His teaching interests include both Native American Studies and history disciplines and includes the American West, American Indian History, the American Southwest, Federal Indian Policy and Sovereignty, Native American Philosophy, and Oklahoma History. Dr. DeSpain's research interests include the American fur trade, cross-cultural violence in the West, Native Americans in popular culture, Oklahoma environmental history, and Chickasaw history. He was the founding editor of Native Matters, the Journal of Native American Studies, and is also a former editor for the Chickasaw Nation's Journal of Chickasaw History and Culture. And when the weather warms up, he's been known to play a mean set of bagpipes while walking around campus. Please welcome with me Professor Dr. Last but certainly not least, Mr. Professor Craig Dawkins, who has been on a few of our panels, so I'm very pleased to have him join us again. Professor Dawkins is Professor of Personal Finance and Economics in the Business and Information Technology Division here at Rose State College. His courses include Personal Finance, Introduction to Investments, and both Principles of Micro and Macroeconomics. Professor Dawkins came to Rose State College in January of 2005 after a long career in the private sector. He served as the CEO of CDI Incorporated from 1997 to 2002 and went on to work as a financial advisor for Morgan Stanley in 2003. From 1984 through 1997, he held various private sector positions as a buyer, regional big ticket manager, and general manager for nationally known retailers such as Dillard's, department stores, Montgomery Ward, and Barnes & Noble. He's managed stores in Texas, Florida, Alabama, and Oklahoma. In 2007, Professor Dawkins was appointed to serve as a member of the Oklahoma County Jail Funding Task Force. He currently serves as a group leader for Oklahoma City-based disfluency group called Speak Out, which provides support for people who have issues with stuttering. Craig graduated from Carl Albert High School in 1981 and earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Central Oklahoma. Upon completion of his MBA at Oklahoma Christian University, he was inducted to the Delta Mu Delta Honor Society, an organization that recognizes top-performing business school graduates. Please welcome Professor Craig Dawkins. And now I am going to turn this over to our panelists. Each of them have about 10 minutes to offer any kind of beginning remarks that they would like to. After that, we will open it up for questions from our audience. And we'll just, if it's all right with you guys, we'll just go down the row here, starting with Dr. DeSpain.
Oh, my goodness, thanks. I get to kick it off. Freedom. As I was thinking about this, I had to do some searching around. we talk about freedom in lectures quite a bit, but it seems to me that it's quite an obscure topic, and not obscure, but a convoluted topic. We say it all the time. Right? We love it, politicians speak to it. We use it in our lectures all the time, but we rarely contemplate its deeper meanings. And so I even caught myself in that, having to contemplate the deeper meanings with this panel. And as I was screwing around, I found something by George Orwell. I don't know, did anybody else come upon this? And he used the phrase kind of misunderstood words in a paper they'd read. And he included freedom and democracy. The idea is that we overuse these concepts so much that we've obscured their meanings. We really have no idea what the true foundation of those meanings are because we've just overabused them. And that fit very well, I think, in the way that I was contemplating the idea of freedom. In a historical context, I had to look deeper at it. In historical context, we as historians, we take a concept like freedom and we just want to peel the layers back. And as we do that, we have to say, all right, where does freedom fit in, again, in a historical context? And over time, what we discover is that freedom has a variety of meanings. It's applied in a multitude of different situations. And, whether it's an ideology, whether it's part of how we understand the social condition, opportunities, things like that. But what we understand with history in general is that these kind of concepts, they're organic. They keep changing, and of course they're different from person to person. I mean, the way that I would look at history and the way that I would look at freedom in my historical context is going to be different than any of my other history colleagues in here. We've just got different cultural baggages. So that's one of the things I think makes understanding the concept so difficult, is that each one of us has a different idea about what that means. But we rarely talk about those differences. We usually, in a political context, we're usually shouting at each other and not trying to understand it. And I think we've seen a lot of that lately with this upcoming election year. For me specifically, I'm going to have to draw from my where I'm most comfortable, and that's going to be the Native American position on what freedom is. And we may talk about freedom as a nation. We seem to think that it's one of the core ideologies, and we therefore have to be the bastion of it, the conservator of it, and the propagator of it, since we find ourselves in all corners of the globe, believing that many must partake of our version of freedom. The problem is at home we have done a fairly dismal job of practicing what we preach. And so if we were to take a look, and again, this is how we as a nation, if we're going to understand freedom, we need to take a look at our own history. We need to contemplate how have we done with it. And the reality is that freedom for some almost always means lack of freedom for others. I may have the freedom of opportunity, but my opportunity is at the cost of somebody else. And if we take a look at the Native American experience, unless you're indigenous, you shouldn't be here. If that makes sense. I mean, all the land was possessed by them. And I know we've got their history, but they possessed all the land. And through the idea of freedom, we have dispossessed Native societies of almost every inch of terra firma. I mean, we've relegated them to small little reservations. We've said to them, you cannot practice your religion. And that's even in more modern context. You need to rid yourself of your identity. You need to be divested of your culture. That is the American idea of freedom, is you need to partake of ours. It needs to be Christian. It needs to be capitalistic. It needs to be, follow the social customs. And if you look at federal Indian policy, it is just a constant march by this nation to divest Native Americans of their freedom. Freedom of land, like I said, freedom of life. And court decisions have made it to the point that tribes can't even rule themselves. They really are under the control of Congress. They can be terminated. Your blood quantum, your identity as an Indian is determined not by your tribe so much, but by your CDBI card that the federal government says you have enough blood, you could be an Indian. Well, that's taking away even a tribe's ability to say, or an individual's ability to say, I am indigenous. So it's kind of horrific if you take a look at what we've done, and we can apply that, and that's why I wore my tie today. Somebody commented, "Hey, that's a pretty nice tie," and it says, "Is that from Hawaii?" I go, "Yes, it is. It's from Hawaii," because of course, we've done the same thing to Hawaiians. We've taken their land, taken their culture, taken everything. We've left them with very little. And so these peoples, I hope I'm not digressing too far here, but these indigenous peoples now become influenced by this rhetoric of freedom. And their whole existence in a contemporary setting now is a struggle, a fight to hold on to what little freedoms they can. It's a fight for what they call sovereignty. Now, sovereignty, there's another word that we can throw in this whole mix: freedom, democracy, opportunity. Sovereignty is one that gets overused by Native Americans, but they're in a constant struggle to try to sustain their sovereignty, economic sovereignty, political sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, because all those things are constantly under assault by a nation that professes freedom. The freedom to be who you are, and but we can't seem to allow. We want to intrude on Native American resources. We want to keep tapping into what is identity, all these things. And so it is a struggle for many. And so we could pull other minorities in this conversation. I'm just speaking from what I'm most familiar with. But honestly, this nation's history of freedom is one that has been very exclusive to a certain portion, white, Protestant, population. And it's been very, it hasn't worked out so well for others who now continue to struggle to maybe find that piece of freedom and what it means to them. How about if I leave it at that?
So I think that's a good setup for what I was thinking about when given this topic of America's love-hate relationship with freedom or with liberty. And one of the things that came up for me was how this idea of liberty in the history of America is very much coming out of our experience in the first couple centuries of our nation with living on an expanding frontier. And in this situation when you had that American civilization growing rapidly in a way that obviously was not in recognition of the rights of American Indians who were there already, but even aside from that, created a situation where you had cities and you had communities where there was a natural check within the community on how much you could impose on what you could do to someone, because there was always an outlet, there was always another frontier, there was always going further west into areas that were unsettled, into areas where you could, even though life was obviously extremely difficult and the likelihood of survival was not that great, you would have a certain kind of liberty. And as we expand the frontier, and as we eventually run out of frontier and take about as much land from the native nations as there is left to take, we then come up with another dilemma, and I think is a continuing dilemma for American society, which is how do we now live among ourselves in communities where we're having to deal with each other in ways without that kind of safety valve. Another thing that I think is important when we're talking about liberty, and something that I think is missed in certain discussions of liberty, is that the absence of government power is not automatically filled with liberty, because there are all kinds of power, and power tends to fill a vacuum. And sometimes the absence of one particular kind of government is filled by another particular kind of government, or it's filled by private actors. And I'll just give a few examples of that. I think the most obvious one in the American historical experience is the African American experience, where often people advocating for civil rights, people advocating for the end of slavery, people fighting wars over these things, are having to appeal to a larger federal government in order to protect liberties against the encroachment of state and local and private sector individuals and communities. And so we're asking for government power to create this liberty that is not being allowed by the operator of this lunch counter or this theater or the superintendent of schools or this governor. And you have this tension between not liberty and government control, but various governments, various interests, various groups within society. And that's also something that happens when we look at what's going on in economic activity. In the opening remarks, it was mentioned that we restrict mutually advantageous economic activity, but I think that what that can miss is that these agreements are not always mutually advantageous, and oftentimes when we're having an economic activity happen, it's from very different points of power, very different levels of information. And as a democracy, we have gotten together and come up with some rules to try to restore some balances to that, to try to give some government regulations that counterbalance these otherwise unequal relationships, which I think are very restrictive of liberty and of equality. So for example, it was mentioned regulation of Uber, and another example that's kind of in the news lately is Airbnb, and how we have this new technology, this new thing that's giving a lot of people opportunities to rent their apartments and to make a mutual agreement, but at the same time, because we don't have any safeguards, there have been incidents such as a family at an Airbnb, the father sat on a tire swing and the tree was dead and it fell and he was killed. And this is a situation where we have in hotels a set of regulations and a long-standing history of liability where we, one, create that safety and also have a system for making sure that if that does happen, someone is held responsible and there is more of a protection than what you would get when you're just kind of thrown into a situation where you don't have the information and there's no one else out there who is responsible for overseeing that. And I say that not to say we need to regulate Airbnb more, or we need to crack down on Uber and make them behave like a normal taxi company. I don't think there's clear black and white answers to any of these issues, and all of these are ongoing negotiations that we have as a society as we come up with new technologies, as we start to live in new kinds of arrangements, in new economies. But to say that this is all about liberty or the lack of liberty, I think oversimplifies. And what it comes down to is that we have a continuing need to figure out how to live with each other in ways in which we often have many conflicting needs and many conflicting places that we appeal to, and that's hard work.
So I'll pick up from that. Lots of good thoughts here. When I think about liberty, I think about the ideals of vice versus virtue. In Oklahoma, for example, it is vice for someone to purchase cannabis and make brownies with it. In Colorado, it's a virtue. They tax it, they make money on that endeavor, it's a business enterprise. Here, it gets you thrown in a jail, a box. In Colorado, it's like drinking a beer. When we take vice and virtue and we collectivize those concepts, and we use majoritarian ideals, which would be to take what a Democratic majority feels is vice and punish those who disagree, it erodes liberty, whether we're talking about cannabis, whether we're talking about marriage equality, where any person can marry the person of their choice, the adult of their choice, when that's defined by a majority to mean one thing and one thing only, to the detriment of others who would disagree. When we're talking about religious liberty, where Muslims, for example, in the state of Oklahoma, were at one point denied their religious liberties to practice peaceful Sharia in the customs of their own faith. Many people thought that that had something to do with, I don't know, some radical idea. Religious law has been imposed and used by individuals in contracts for thousands of years. Whether we're talking about Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, or Muslim, these kinds of contracts have been written up for years. And to deny one particular faith their right to write up contracts on that basis is to deny liberty to a group of people on some majoritarian basis. When we're talking about immigration, unless you are a Native American, all of us came here, or our ancestors came here from some other land, and they freely came. They had the liberty to do that. They didn't like the place where they were coming from. They came to America to start a new life. Nobody told them that they couldn't come here. In fact, they were welcome. And it's very fascinating to be in an age today where we look at immigrants as lawbreakers as a matter of their existence and standing in our space. When in fact they work, they do jobs, and we make it very hard on them as a society to be here and operate freely as somebody that can drive a car because we deny them the right to get a license. Liberty is often not agreed upon because it's viewed in some collective sense rather than an individual sense. If your ancestors hadn't been allowed to come to America, where would you be today? And what right do you have to deny the rights of people that want that same opportunity, that want to come to America today? Also, liberty comes in direct conflict with the ideals of safety and security versus dangers of freedom. I think about what can the police state actually do for us to keep us safe? Are they more valuable in investigating the harm done to us, or are they more valuable in preventing that harm in the first place? And if we want harm prevented in the first place, what rights do we have to give up in order for them to keep us safe and secure? Shouldn't we want them to spy on our email to make sure that no one's plotting against us? Shouldn't we want them to have checkpoints so that they can check our papers to make sure that we are who we say we are? Shouldn't we want them to come to our homes and search and view our home contents to make sure that we aren't a danger to anyone for the greater good? At some point, freedom and liberty comes in conflict with individual freedom. And when it's defined by a collective in such a way as to be a majoritarian ideal, individuals who are in the minority are often abused by a majority that thinks that everyone not of their view is being objectionable or unreasonable. So when we talk about liberty and we talk about this tug of war between the ideals of liberty, too often I think liberty is defined as liberty for me, but not for thee. And I think that'll be a good discussion today, hopefully, when we have the Q&A.
I get the bad cleanup, I guess. And I think I'm going to be a little bit more optimistic. So sorry about that. But I'm tempted. I don't want to violate HIPAA laws in a public university, but I'm tempted to ask questions like, who here has asthma? I would have to raise my hand. Who here has had pneumonia? I would have to raise my hand. Actually, a friend of mine was just in the hospital with pneumonia. All these things that. Well, let me tell you two stories real quick. When I was just out of college, I got to go work in Washington, D.C. And one of the things that my wife and I did that was fascinating was we were house parents for an intern house. We got to have a dozen people who were, in most cases, slightly younger than we were, live with us for a semester at a time, get to know people. And some of these were international students. And I got to know a couple of them and learn their stories, and it was fascinating to me. It was convicting to me, and it really it forced me to be a sort of guarded optimist about our country. The first is my friend Musso, who grew up in Uganda. And as a small boy in Uganda, growing up there in a village, his parents converted from Islam to Christianity. And if you know very much about what happened to the rest of the world, you probably would understand what happened next, which is that they were killed, they were murdered for their religious beliefs. And Musso, to survive himself, had to go and live in the city. He went there when he was 13 years old, and he told me it was the first time he had ever had the feeling of shoes on his feet. First time he had ever put shoes on his feet. He was 13 years old, and it was he said, I was asking him, what is it you notice about this country, right? He said I had to come to America because I wanted to learn the lessons from here so that I could take them back to Uganda, right? So that we could enjoy the blessings of liberty that you take for granted here. And I've been talking with him about the things that he noticed about the United States. He said, you keep dogs as pets. He said, we would never think to keep a dog other than for a future meal, right? The idea of keeping and feeding that size of an animal that is such a level of excess, such a symbol of your financial success in the United States. And the other intern I got to know was a little bit older than me, and she had grown up in Georgia. She didn't speak with an accent, well, not that kind of an accent. She grew up in the Republic of Georgia, in the when she was a little girl was the Soviet Republic of Georgia, and she described to us. And I mean, this again. It's hard, if you want to know about liberty, study tyranny. The most convicting thing I've ever read about liberty is Alexander Solzhenitsyn's work. I listened to it on tape, I'll admit that. It would stack up to about this high on the table. His book, Gulag Archipelago, where he goes through and he talks about that system from the arrests all the way through. I remember toward the end, he talked about the Soviet, that they had their own criminal procedure manual. I remember this because this was shortly after I'd been in law school and struggled through criminal procedure, and they had their own criminal procedure manual. And he says in the book, he says they printed just enough copies to get to foreign journalists. They didn't use it in their system, but they printed enough copies to give to folks at the New York Times and Agency France Press and folks like that. But this friend of mine who grew up in Georgia, she described having a radio built in to their end table in their living room so that they could listen. It was illegal. I mean, her parents, like Musso's parents, would have been taken away, potentially killed if this had been discovered. They had this hidden radio built into their furniture in their living room so that they could listen to the voice of America. And this is what she said. Not to get partisan, but I'll tell you what she said, because this is what she told me. She said she remembered as a little girl listening in November 1984 to the U.S. election returns, and she said we knew if Ronald Reagan won, everything was going to be okay. I mean, that is, and I say that again not to be partisan or to talk about presidential elections, but just to say that what we do here is consequential, right? At least it has the possibility of being consequential, right? Because people from all around the world look to us and recognize that for all the failings that you've just heard discussed, right? For all the failings, and so many failings, they're so obvious here because we've done so well, right? I mean, the reason we can sit here and have a free conversation about mistreatment of Native peoples or about the horrors of slavery is because the contrast in our country is so obvious with the principles that we set out to found this experiment on. My own mission, the reason I work in public policy is because through that experience and some experiences even before that, I just came to the conclusion that there's something different about this country, and I'd really like to understand what it is. I'd really like to understand what it is because I'd like to keep it, right? And I'd like it to grow. I'd like it to be available to more people. I'd like them to choose it freely. I mean, I agree. I don't think we should go and try to force something. I think we should reason with people, which is part of the basis of this experiment. And when you go back, and I explain it this way, I'll just sort of conclude with my very crass gloss on the history of freedom and putting our own country and our own country's principles in context. In the ancient world, you sort of think of the ancient city, and if I had a pen, I'd draw you a picture of the ancient city with a ziggurat in the center, right? The ancient city with the idols up there and the priests on the steps. And your whole identity as a citizen of the city was related to that city. It was specific. It wasn't universal. What mattered most about you was that you were a citizen of that city. Your language was probably different. Your gods were different. Your humanity was not a concept, or at least not an important concept, right? It was your citizenship in that city. That's how the ancient world worked. There were two groups of people who challenged that. They weren't always very popular because of it. One was the ancient Israelites, who had the tendency to temerity, to go around in the desert saying, well, you can worship whatever you want, but we actually think that we have some principles that are true and that apply to everybody. And I think by and large, at their best, they weren't trying to impose that on anyone, but people don't like that very much. When you say, look, you live and let live, but we actually think we're right, and that's just a piece of wood. The other group was the Greeks. And the Greeks had this interesting war council on the Corinthian Isthmus during the Persian Wars. And they had a difference over strategy. Athens had been burned, and the temple had been sacked. This is what was important. Athens had been wiped out. The gods had been carried off. And the Athenians had the strategy they wanted to pursue, and some of the other Greeks had a different strategy. And they said what was a perfectly logical thing to say in the ancient world. Your city's been destroyed. Your gods have been carried off. You are not people. At least you don't have any rights that we need to respect. Your city is, your identity has been wiped out. And the Athenians, I think it's not maybe entirely a coincidence that it's after this and the Athenians actually got their way. It was realpolitik, though. They didn't convince anybody. They just had all the ships. So they got their way by realpolitik. But I don't think it's entirely coincidental. And after this, you have Greek philosophers saying, wait a second, what if our status as human beings is actually more important than our status as citizens of Athens or citizens of Corinth or citizens of Sparta? This was controversial as well. Socrates had to drink poison, but that was the idea, right? The controversial idea, right? Yeah, it didn't work out so well for some of them. But this is the argument, right? The question is there something about us as human beings that's more important than the language we speak, the color of our skin, where we come from? And you fast forward up to 1776, and I think for all of their failings, and they are many, I think you get the single best statement of that idea in the Declaration of Independence, where they say, we think that our status as human beings is the most important thing. And we think that corollary to that, we have an obligation to reason with each other. We have an obligation, even though we're fighting each other, to set our principles on the table and explain them, make an argument about them. And the bizarre thing about our country, captured at the beginning of the Gettysburg Address, is we don't date our birth as a country to a military victory, to July 2nd, 1776. As a lawyer, that would make more sense. John Adams writes this great letter about celebrating independence, and people read it on the 4th of July and forget he was talking about July 2nd. We resolved our independence, very lawyerly, right? It's the principles. We celebrate the principles. At least we that's what we have done. And I think that for all the failings, I think we have to remember what we do here is particularly consequential. This conversation matters here more than it matters other places, because we have more capacity as Americans to change the direction of our country and to fly the flag or hold up the torch or whatever analogy you like for the rest of the world. So I'll conclude with that, but I applaud you all for being here and being part of the conversation. It's my privilege to be here as well. Thank you.
All right, very good. Excellent comments from all of you. Thank you very much. I do want to throw it open, see if we have anyone who wants to ask a question. If not, I've got a couple that I will throw out here, but I want to start off by offering the opportunity for any of our attendees to offer a question to one or all of our panelists. Yes, way up in the back.
Professor Dawkins, I think you said something like our ancestors were welcomed in this country, along those lines. By saying that, don't you think you're actively participating in the erasure of the struggles of immigrants?
Well, when I say they were welcomed, our government at that time actually, believe it or not, at one point invited people from all over the world to just come and settle into land. They were given land, and if they agreed to farm that land and to stay on that land for 5 years, it was theirs to keep. So I don't say it to minimize the struggles of every ethnic group that we can think of that came to the United States in some fashion, but to say that it's different today in the sense that the opportunities that our ancestors had to come to this country, in some ways are much more difficult for people to come into our country. For example, the earliest immigration laws occurred at the end of the 1800s, the Chinese Acts, to keep the Chinese from coming to America. Prior to that, people just came here. And it's not to say that they weren't discriminated against or brought under struggle, but it's a different thing today where they have to live in the shadows today more so than they did back then.
Okay. Anyone else? Maybe they'll think of something. Oh, there we go.
And this is kind of for everybody, but going along some of that line and your touch on immigration, Professor Dawkins and everybody else in this, as Dr. DeSpain said, of course, unless we are true blue Indian, we are all immigrants, right? And I get all of that. Now we're at this point, and hundreds of years later, where we're making these choices about people coming in or out. And I, other than saying thank you to anybody who services our armed forces, and fighting for what we call our freedoms as relative now to a term, to ourselves and collectively. But I think I'd probably say what a lot of people think is the fact that if we took this room and went over to another country and then all of a sudden started demanding that they change their language, they start changing their ways of thinking, their religions, and I have to be careful because not only as a patriot, I am a practicing Christian, so therefore you've got to weigh the measures, but where do we draw that line as far as being acceptance of other people coming to America, knowing that this is how we operate, and then walking in and we want the freedoms of America, but we want to change things to accommodate them, or if I'm speaking on their behalf. We love America, we want to go there and get those freedoms and liberties, but yet we want you to change the way you think, change the way you answer your phone, whether it's an A, B, or 1, 2, or 3 of whatever nationality you want to answer it as, change your schooling, changing the way that we practice Sharia law, or anything like that. Where do we, and again, I understand we're not the true Americans here. I mean, we live in this country as Americans, but where's that line drawn? Am I making any sense there?
Perfect sense. I hope I'm understanding what you're saying, but it seems like, and I don't know if I was hoping to maybe kind of lose this, but we have a set of principles and ideals that we use to define us uniquely within the globe. And we love to wrap our freedom and democracy, capitalism. We interchange these things all the time. And then, and again, I'm hoping this where I'm understanding you're going, we love it so much, we got to export it. And we have to export it into other people's places. And as I will say in my classes, we've gallivanted around the globe. And we'd love to have a little democracy and a little capitalism. No, thank you. Oh, no, you're going to get some of that. And we've marched into the Philippines, we've marched to the Hawaiian Islands, we've marched into little corners of Latin America, we've taken half of Mexico at one time. And we do a pretty good job of exporting our idea of freedom, which is not somebody else's idea. And I know we've got a unique, exceptional experience here, but you know what? Our version doesn't always fit other people's version, but we have these blinders on that we have to export it. Now, what that really is, let's take what it is. It's colonialism. And as much as we want to say that we aren't, we have engaged in colonialism. We want to we want to utilize and expand beyond our boundaries in order to bring others into various controls so that we can utilize. And I'm going to use the Hawaiian Islands as a great example. We went there and we took it inappropriately. We took we took a monarchy for the process that we could have a middle Pacific docking point so we could expand our commercialism and our imperialism into the rest of the Pacific Rim. And then, and so, and now I'm digressing a little bit, but the American experience in some ways is merely a continuation of the overall Western experience. You mentioned the kind of the westward march of empire, which is in itself the expansion of colonialism, indigenous peoples here and then over other. So we've got to be, so if we're going to get up there, we're going to say free, we've got to be very careful about, what we say and what we do. That's where I'm saying in this time, that's why we can look at our past and say, we've got to be even more cautious. If we're going to say we got it, we're going to practice it, we've got to be very careful about it, about what it is. And there's the rub. We don't know the true meaning of it. It's that debated meaning. And that's I'm just throwing those out as how I see it. So there you go. I probably went too long, but there you go.
And I just think the biggest concern is in today, in this century, in the way we do things as quote unquote Americans, that would be like me coming to your home and telling you need to change the rules to accommodate me.
Right.
And I don't believe that that's right.
I would say from the more modern question, I am optimistic about the future of our country, and I think that American culture is strong enough and diverse enough that it gains from new people coming in and new ideas coming in, and it's not a situation where Americans are being forced to change. It's neighbors who are being introduced to each other and learning from each other. And we still have a democratic system. We still have the same kind of creative growth of our society and our communities as we've always had, and it has been a great asset to America that we've been able to incorporate waves of people, and every wave has brought its own new ideas. And more often than not, what you see is that a lot of the new ideas kind of become part of the existing culture, and actually the existing culture is much more resilient than I think a lot of people feel like it is when looking at the latest wave.
I would say that I like your analogy about the home. I like that analogy a lot. Because if today I wanted to invite friends from Mexico to come and live with me in my home, to be my guests, my government would try to prevent me from doing that. So my individual right to have people come and stay at my home and to enjoy my own personal property rights and allow my own expression of that in my own property is imposed upon by the society at large that says, no, they're not here legally. And so it's very much it's a market of ideas as much as it's a market, an economic market. These market of ideas clash. I once had a friend, he was a financial advisor, he was in Chicago, and he grew up Jewish. And his entire, he was explaining to me about his entire education experience in America was that every day when he showed up at school, they did a Christian prayer every day, and he was forced to participate as a matter of the duty that the teacher had of the classroom. And it was very objectionable to him, but he didn't feel comfortable or able to say, hey, can we mix in a Jewish prayer every once in a while? Not all of us believe like that. And so again, it gets in very much into this majoritarian idea about, well, what the most of us think is what you should change to be like us. We shouldn't make exception for your differences, but you should make exception for ours and just join our side. I think therein is where some of that conflict is.
Any political society only exists to the extent that you can define your society. I mean borders, as much as I I would support a very open immigration process. I mean, once you have a political society, you get to define those standards. I think probably the tragedy of where we are today is we have a system that works terribly. I mean, it's just a disastrous system, and border security is a tiny piece of it. I mean, the whole thing is bizarre. I've had friends from Canada who were working in the United States, and all of a sudden something goes wrong with their visa, and they don't know what to do. And I mean, it's a bizarre system, I think. But at the same time, you get back to the principles, right? I mean, you get to, by virtue of having a political society, as every nation does, right, decide what the process is for people coming in and going out. And I think it's a little too easy to say we simply benefit by having new ideas. I think we have benefited by having new ideas in the past because we've clung to that central idea that our country was about, which again, I mean, don't let the failures subsume the fact that there is a core principle there that asserts that it's true, right? We get to decide for ourselves whether we think it's true or not. But the Declaration of Independence, you read the first two paragraphs, it asserts a principle that either is true or it's a lie. I mean, you have a choice there. I don't like this idea that, well, freedom just means whatever people think it means. I mean, that's that's fine. But the idea that as far as it goes, the problem is it doesn't give you a good foundation on which to stand to criticize the atrocities in this country or anywhere else. We benefit from new ideas and people coming here as long as we cling to the one thing that matters most, which is the idea that there is a common humanity, there is a common human dignity, and everything else ought to be ordered around that. And if other people don't believe that, I don't think we should let them into our country. And I think that's just a common sense proposition.
We have a question from one of our online viewers, so I'm going to go to Travis.
Professor Kristen Wolf joins us from Chicago, and she asks, can Professor Dawkins please discuss how civil asset forfeiture affects the liberties of all citizens?
Be glad to. So what happens every day all over the United States is someone is pulled over because of some reason. If they are carrying a large sum of cash, say $10,000, say they were traveling across the country and they decided they would bring cash with them. Essentially, a police officer or state trooper can just essentially determine at their, without really establishing a legal basis to arrest anyone or make any specific charge of a crime, seize those dollars, that property, as being suspicion of being a result of drug proceeds. If that person, their monies are construed and determined to be guilty, if they want their money back, they're free to go. But if they want their money back, they have to come back and prove that those dollars that they were carrying across the country did not come from drug proceeds. And the average seizure in the state of Oklahoma is something akin to $800. And you're an attorney. How much would it cost me to get my money back?
I'm a policy attorney. I'm not the kind of attorney that makes money, but no, it is. As my wife reminds me from time to time. But no, that's exactly right. You can't. You're in a no-win position. You can't hire an attorney if it's $1,000 and you're going to lose for winning.
I'm going to keep my money. There have been attorneys, or not attorneys. There have been people that have seized money that use that directly to the benefit of their agencies. Stories of people using it, renting, paying off student loans with those seized dollars, living in houses that have been seized rent-free for periods of years. These kinds of abuses happen, and that, of course, if your property is guilty and you're free to go, I think that's a violation of liberty. At some point, there should be a charge, and there is an extreme perverse incentive for a agency to take the money knowing that their agency is going to get to keep that money or a large portion of it, because they stand to benefit.
A question here.
Yes, Societas was supposedly a former senator of Rome, and he said, as once we suffered from crimes, now we suffer from laws. So my question would be, how much culpability does all government entities share for theft through taxes, manipulation through propaganda, and destruction of free markets through intervention?
Wow, that's a.
Well, let me answer it this way, because yeah, this is something that I didn't manage to get in my original remarks. When the Bill of Rights was proposed to the original Constitution, there was a wonderful and meaningful debate that Alexander Hamilton describes at the end of the Federalist Papers. And it was between two groups of people who all wanted freedom. I believe, that's my opinion. Who all wanted freedom. They wanted a limited federal government, whatever. They weren't all libertarians, sorry, but they all wanted the federal government to be very limited. And some of them said we need a Bill of Rights. And others said the problem with that is what we wanted, the original Constitution defines these limited government powers, and we want the public perception and the reality to be, in terms of the federal government now, a great sea of liberty with little islands of government power. And our concern about enumerating rights, and I think this, you can judge for yourself sort of who's right and who's wrong, and it's a counterfactual, and so there's no right answer. But they said the problem with the Bill of Rights is you create the perception that you have a great sea of government power and these little tiny islands of rights on which hopefully you get to stand. And I mean, I think you see that particularly with regards to the federal government. I mean, at the beginning, being on the Supreme Court was boring because they didn't do very much. People had almost no contact with the federal government until early in the 20th century, unless you lived in a port city or near a military installation, and those were few and far between. And now, I mean, it's, you know, people look to the highest level possible of government to make all these decisions, very consequential in our lives, some for the good, but oftentimes, as you described, infringing on people's liberties in ways that are hard even to recognize at the time.
I do have to say, I think that it is, I think it's offensive to describe taxes as theft, because that is something that rejects the whole premise of democratic self-governance. Taxes are the way that we have agreed in a system that, you know, absolutely is flawed, absolutely can drive you crazy, is inefficient, is messy, but it's what we've got. And what we found throughout our history is that there are plenty of common goods that we need as a people to come together and invest in those things like our schools and like our safety and like our infrastructure. And throughout history, the first attempt at American governance, the Articles of Confederation, fell apart because they couldn't assess any taxes, and there was, you know, almost a military coup because they couldn't pay the soldiers, and then they were able to come back and say, okay, we need to assess some taxes. And then in the Great Depression, we had a worldwide economic collapse, and we had a feeling that America maybe was going to go the way of fascist nations or of these other nations because capitalism was failing. And we got together and we said, okay, we need to invest in people, and we need to protect the common good, to protect democracy, not to lose it. And there are periodic times in our history when we've had to save capitalism from itself and also come together and agree that we're going to pay taxes even though we don't like it and nobody likes it, but it's part of living in a society. And I think that's important. And obviously you can have arguments about what level taxes should be that's most optimal for the society or for the time. But to say that it's theft is completely untrue.
Anyone else?
I would just add to that I think that very much people do agree that the government should be involved in doing some things. The government, even the most ardent limited government advocate says we ought to have jails, says we ought to have prisons, we need to have a military. And to the extent that those things need to exist, they have to be funded. I don't think the debate so much is over if government should do things. The debate to some extent is how much should government do, and what should be taxed and how much should be taxed. Tax rates in this country have been as high as 91%. When the tax code began, it didn't begin as 91%. Top tax rates were less than 5%. So I think whenever we take a look and we say, well, how much should we be taxed? I think very much the devil's in the details of what we want government doing. The more we want government to do, the more taxes are needed to do those things. One of the biggest problems I see in this process of government is the interference of free trade. Free trade otherwise would allow us to buy goods and services at the lowest prices we can. When government intercedes, it often intercedes on behalf not of the economy, but on certain owners of a business that think they deserve government protection to maintain their profits. So I think that when we think about what taxes are for and what government should be doing, I think we have to keep in mind that I think we all think government should be doing something. I think the question is how much and how much should we have to pay. Right now, the top tax bracket is 39.6%. If you live in a state with a 10% income tax, you're getting close to half your income, not counting property taxes and all the other taxes that are imposed on our society. So I think how much is very much the question.
Okay, I'll come back to you.
Okay, for Professor England, you keep saying like don't dwell on our nation's failures, but even as immigration laws, people who come here for the so-called freedom that we can offer, people who do follow the legalization process still get that residency leave. They abide by our laws, they get a job, and they support themselves, but when that time's up, it's up. Do you not think that's something that we should dwell on?
You mean as far people who are like who are here on a green card that expires? Is that? Well, yeah. I mean that's not. That might be bad policy. I mean, I think a lot of our immigration laws are bad policy. I mean, in that case, I don't think anybody set out to do something that's inherently discriminatory. I think that in a lot of cases, you have immigration laws that are designed to benefit big businesses and big employers, and that aren't designed to benefit either the people who want to come here or even just our nation sort of as a whole. So no, I work in public policy, which basically means all I do is try to think of areas where the policy should be changed, ought to be better. But at the same time, I think you do get this tone today that it's like my favorite professor in high school had been a Jesuit in training, and he used to describe the self-flagellation and all that. He escaped, but I think there's a tremendous benefit in learning from our mistakes and a tremendous cost in dwelling on them as an individual person or as a society.
Okay.
I had an interesting contrast to begin developing in my head as I was listening to him with Dr. DeSpain. Always had the thought that the majority always rules. But in this case, when the indigenous, the ones that were here first, they were the majority, and the explorers and then later the settlers, they were the minority. But the indigenous had wood and feather to protect themselves and flint, but those in the minority had lead and
microbes.
Yeah, right. Yes. Yes.
And and so yeah. So I'm just trying to. So with that, are we saying that the coming of the Western world and the bringing of technology has given them? Is that where you I hear that argument?
No, just the contrast that the indigenous they were the majority.
Yeah,
But the minority they had a higher ability to through guns and bullets and lead.
Had to impose them.
Yeah, it was a toxic mix at the right time with the microbes and guns, germs, and seal. And Jared Diamond's great book exploring that concept. But their majority status quickly diminished to minority status, and we have the tipping of the balance, and that comes back. I will say, I know I said earlier, that's your process of colonialism and imperialism. And as much as we want to disagree, maybe or agree on this panel, that process of colonialism, imperialism within the indigenous world is ongoing.
That's right, yeah, that's
When
my.
you have families, when you have Lakota
You're
families in South
telegraphing what
Dakota,
yes.
when you have indigenous families in South Dakota, even to this day, where the government goes in and seizes those youth at nearly 50%, because the state wants to then say you're inadequate parents because you're not doing it this certain way. That's going on within the last handful of years. So I don't know if that's freedom, when a government can go in and take your children, say that you're not treating them right, you're not giving them what we deem the proper education, the proper freedoms that they deserve, and so you rob them of their identity and stuff. So I know we can wrap I'm the pessimist. We got the optimist on one side. I'm the pessimist at times, and the only reason that I love when we got this yin and yang thing going on, because if we don't have that, then we aren't asking the hard questions on both sides, and that's why.
That's what makes us great, is it?
Yeah.
We can have the.
So anyway, so again, I come back to that issue. What is freedom? And for some, freedom has worked out very well. For some, freedom, but for others, even within our society, that whatever that freedom is, it's not as full, or it's not fulfilling, or it has a different context altogether. And that's kind of the beauty of the American system, that we can all have those variances, but have that umbrella of some protections and stuff. But we always got to be on the guard. I think that's maybe the key thing that I would say in all this. We've got to protect kind of that idea of freedom and not let it get too far, whether it's over taxation or whether it's the intrusion of health and human services into certain families and stuff like that. We've just always got to be on the guard. If not, we'll abuse it very quickly, and somebody will lose out and somebody will gain in the process. That's always the case. So.
We're going to take another question from online.
Sean Denny asks, can we trust the democratic and electoral process to justly and accurately represent the interests of the many diverse groups in the U.S.?
I would love to. You want to go?
Well, I mean, the answer is the answer is two things, right? And one is what Winston Churchill said about democracy. It's the worst form of government, except that everything that's ever been tried is even worse. And the other, and I forget who said this, might have been G.K. Chesterton, is that democracy is an idea with very little moral weight. Majority rules is essentially the will of the stronger, right? Go back and read your Plato and read Thrasymachus. And that is a part. The downside of that question, or the negative answer to that question, is a part of why I think we should have very limited government, because ultimately there are some things that we have to do, military defense in a limited way, hopefully, jails in a limited way, hopefully, right? There are some things I think we sort of obviously have consensus we need to do, but other than that, you're imposing majoritarianism on people to force them not to get an Uber, use Airbnb, or do whatever they want to do. I think that question gets right at the heart of why government needs to be limited. At its best, it's a monopoly full of people who like power.
Yeah, and I would add that in Oklahoma is a special case. Oklahoma, since is the only state in the country that is, in its last 3 elections for president, has had only 2 choices, a Republican and a Democrat. Fortunately, because the Libertarian Party spent over $100,000 and collected 40,000 signatures, hopefully they'll be able to get 25,000 valid signatures out of that to allow the Libertarian Party to be on the ballot for the first time since 2000. You can be anything you want politically as long as it's a Republican or Democrat in this state. We used to make fun of the Soviet Union because they had 1 political party. We have 2. Woohoo! Can 2 parties theoretically contain all of the varied interests, the political views, the ideologies that we find in the country? I think it's very difficult. I think what we see today going on in the Republican and Democrat Party is very illustrative of the fact that you have factions inside both parties that are tugging and warring with one another for, supremacy so that they can present their person for the selection for the country, either a R or a D. Meanwhile, for a while, the leading candidate of the Republican Party was Donald Trump. That's an applause line, actually, or not an applause line, but a laugh line. So what I'm saying is, no, I don't believe that when you look at our democracy today, that the way it's structured in a winner-take-all system pays adequate homage to the minority views that are found in many states. When we vote for President of the United States, we do electoral college, of course, as you know. It's a winner-take-all with the exception of Nebraska, and I think someone else might have changed the name. Okay. And so that means if you get 50% plus one vote, all the electoral votes go to the winner. And in a winner-take-all system, that's a tough way to govern, because then, of course, the majority, which is 50% plus one, gets to impose its will. And when you look at the number of times Congress has flipped between Republicans and Democrats and Republicans and Democrats again, at some point, the old adage, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, hoping for a different result. And so, yeah, I would like to see personally more political competition, more political freedom, so that at least in our state, you could, if you don't like the choices, just write in a name. We can't even do that without spoiling your ballot in the state. So I would like to see that.
I think our democratic system is doing a fairly decent job of representing the interests of those who show up. But we have a situation where in Oklahoma, the most recent elections in 2014, if you look at turnout of all eligible voters, it was about 29%, less than a third. If you look at turnout among people aged 18 to 29, it was 11%. The number of voters in 2014 ages 65 and older outnumbered all voters aged 45 and younger. And so we have a situation where, especially for state and local elections, there's a small sliver of the population that's actually showing up to vote. And there's also a, I think, unfortunate view of democracy that just focuses like a laser beam on who's running for president. And that's honestly the decision that each one of us as individuals has the absolute least amount of influence on. In Oklahoma, in fact, it's probably basically zero, because we know how Oklahoma is going to vote. But even in Oklahoma, of all sorts of different political opinions, we have a very large amount of influence on our local elections, on our state elections, and not just voting, but the participation in democracy that I think we need a better word for, but in short form, it's kind of a voting plus of talking to your representatives, talking to your neighbors, participating in communities, participating in political parties, whether it's Democratic or Republican or Libertarian or Green or any other. There are lots of ways for us to be part of that ever going on conversation that unfortunately too many of us are just opting out.
All right, I think we are running up against our time. So I want to say thank you first to our panelists again for being here today. Very much appreciate it. I want to take just a minute to make some recognitions. I want to thank Dr. Caldwell and Dr. Francis Hendricks was here a little bit earlier, as well as Dr. Ortiz and Dr. Batchoffer from our Social Sciences Division. Thank you. We have some faculty in the audience as well. And I want to make note of two guests that are here. The Reverend David Oxley, who's a longtime family friend, and very honored that he was able to attend, and Mr. Rick Moore, who was on our very first panel discussion way back in the fall of 14, and who's an alumni of Rose State College. And so I want to thank them for attending as well. And finally, again, I want to say a thank you to the John Templeton Foundation and the Institute for Humane Studies for their support of this project. And thank you all for attending. If you have your surveys, please turn those in to me. You can turn them